So thanks for coming tonight. You're very good for giving me time in your Thursday afternoon, evening. It's been a long day already. So the schedule for tonight will be roughly, we'll go through a bit of an introduction to monitoring, then the I-WeBS methods, a little bit about counting techniques, some hot tips for water bird ID. And we can take a short break, people to grab a cup of coffee or water, whatever you want. And then we'll have a look at the data and maybe give some time to answering questions. So why do we monitor birds? Well, for one, they're conspicuous and aesthetically pleasing. They're easy for people to get a good buy-in, and they're a good ad for promoting biodiversity. Plus, they're good bio-indicators, so they reflect the health of our habitats. If there's issues with birds, that signals there must be issues elsewhere. We're also, as a state, required to monitor birds and the habitats that they use, so that and feed this information back into the European Birds Directive, because if we don't monitor them, we can't know how they're doing. So monitoring is really the first step. It's where it all begins, and then we can assess the status of the various populations. Are they going up, down, staying the same? Is their distribution changing? All of that kind of stuff. And this then helps as a state, us to prioritize and take appropriate action, whether that be site protection, like designating special protected areas, managing specific habitats, or deciding that we just don't know enough about what's causing these particular trends, and so further research is needed. One of the long-term surveys that has been running, and when I say long-term, I don't mean running year to year, but Atlas allows us to compare historic kind of distribution of birds and gives us snapshots in time by which we can see how populations distributions are changing. And this is very like I-WeBS and a lot of our surveys. A huge volunteer effort went into this. People went out and surveyed squares throughout the country, and it has shown us some really interesting results when we compared the various different atlases and how things have changed between them. So for example, with yellowhammer, it shows us that there has been a huge, large-scale decline. So the grey dots you see here on the map indicate that the range has been lost there. In previous atlases, in the 1970s, there was yellowhammer in all of those grey dot areas. So they have been lost in all of these places. The ones without any dots, they stay the same, but red dots are where they weren't at the time, and range has been gained. So I've 5 positive dots, but by and large, not a good story. And curlew, as you know, that this might have, if we were to do an atlas straight away, this might have changed again. But many of you will have heard that curlew, our breeding curlew that occur here in the spring and summer months, not those that are here during the wintering months, have declined massively. They've lost a lot of their breeding grounds, and now there's just a few strongholds. So it's a very stark picture. Also a stark picture, but on the other side of the scale is buzzard, which was extinct here not too long ago, and people would have gone up north in particular to twitch buzzards because they were such a rarity. But now, especially driving along the motorway in Dublin, for example, you can spot them no problem. I regularly see at least a few on my journey, which is amazing because we're short of a lot of birds of prey here, and having top predators is a really healthy sign. And it's nice to see birds reestablishing naturally like this. and birds that are colonizing naturally as well, like woodpecker. And again, for both of these, buzzard and woodpecker, the deaths have probably increased since the last atlas. But great spotted woodpecker, as many of you will know, came over from the UK and were first established in South Wicklow, and since they have been slowly spreading as a breeding species, mostly kind of staying along that East Coast band, but they have been found in several different parts of the country now at this stage. So that's really uplifting, and that was just a matter of them kind of reaching saturation point in the UK. Young birds flew over here to find new territories. So now we're lucky enough to have them. Some people even get them on their feeders. So it's all changing, and birds are constantly on the move. As you see, some of it's negative, some of it's positive, but it's important that we know what's going on. In terms of water birds and wetland habitats specifically, this is where the Irish Wetland Bird Survey comes in. There's a bit of background to the survey. It was established in the winter of 94 and 95, and it has been running every year ever since. So it's our first long-term water bird monitoring scheme in Ireland. There was various monitoring of water birds, some different species up until then, but nothing as long-term, nothing that allowed us the comparability over the years, over the months, like I-WeBS does. And it has had a huge volunteer input since the very start, which is amazing. It's great to have the boots on the ground. It's great to have the enthusiasm. It's great to have people who are really willing to be custodians of their local wetlands and the buy-in from that point of view. There's also a lot of MPWS staff and some BirdWatch Ireland staff as well who undertake the counts. We're ever so grateful for everybody who takes part, and as our MPWS who fund the survey. So MPWS fund it and I-WeBS coordinate. Sorry, BirdWatch Ireland coordinated. So our team at present consists of myself as the coordinator. Leslie Lewis is the project manager and does a lot of some of the technical data stuff, data requests and things. A lot of them will be coming from Leslie. Brian Burke is one of the scientific officers, and John Kennedy is the other scientific officer. So it's a well-oiled machine at the moment. Yeah, and the surveys are carried out, as I said, by a network of volunteers. So there's nearly 400 skilled volunteers, around 55 MPWS staff, and a few BirdWatch Ireland staff posted in various different corners of the country. And since the start, over 1,000 volunteers have taken part since 1994. So it's been a really great effort and bore some really important results, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So some of you might know well at this stage, but some of you might be a bit perplexed as to what actually constitutes a water bird. The Ramsar definition would be that they are ecologically dependent on wetlands. For I-WeBS, we specifically survey our core wildfowl, so the swans, geese, and ducks, wildfowl allies, grebes, rails, cormorants, herons, and divers, and waders, everything from sanderling up to curlew. And we also survey gulls, terns, and kingfisher, largely because they're not terribly well surveyed anywhere else, and they occur at a lot of the sites where I-WeBS is undertaken. And wetlands as well, which range from shallow coastline to wet grasslands and everything in between, turlocks, lakes, rivers, etc. They're really important. So it is really important that we know how healthy they are, how the habitats are doing. They're important migration rest areas for all our wintering water birds and other species too. They provide vital habitat. They provide food, both for biodiversity and for ourselves, also recreation. They store a lot of carbon, protect us from floods, You know that they filter our water and they also supply us with water. So they're really incredible resources, which have often been thought of kind of just wasteland. Can't build anything there. It's not productive, but it's productive in so many other ways. So they're really crucial for biodiversity and for preventing some of the effects of climate change. So ideally, we need to be protecting them and not destroying them if we're going to have any chance of stopping or slowing the loss of biodiversity. And as I said, wetlands, they range from shallow grassland, shallow coastline to wet grassland. So as you can imagine, in a wet country like ours with a nice temperate climate, they can be found throughout the country. So I-WeBS sites in particular, there's 300 of them, and these include our around 100 of our special protected areas, and a lot of these are subdivided into about 800 subsites. So as you can imagine, it takes a big observer effort to cover all of this area. Ireland is particularly important for water birds in the wintering stage of their life cycle, because a lot of hundreds of thousands of water birds travel south, fly south, along what we call the East Atlantic Flyway, which is like a migration highway, this migration route that goes right from the Arctic, filters down through Northwest Europe, right down to South Africa. And as all of these bird species filter through Ireland, a lot of them make pit stops, either coming to or from wintering sites further south, so they can refuel for their journey, but many just stay here and avail of the abundance of food and generally ice-free feeding that can be found at all these different wetlands. And it's important for them because they need to spend as much of this time as they can feeding, bulking up, so that they can withstand then that journey home and hopefully have enough energy to have a successful breeding season the following spring or summer. This is just a graphic that shows you the East Atlantic Flyway here highlighted in white. And as you can see, Ireland is kind of nicely positioned right in the middle of that funnel. So we capture a lot of the species flowing through. So yeah, water birds in particular act as really good indicators of wetland quality, wetland health, and we're required by law to protect listed rare and vulnerable species, regularly occurring migratory species, and wetlands, especially those of international importance. That I-WeBS helps us to identify which are of international importance. So to establish all of these things, these criteria, and to be able to fulfill those requirements, the MPWS fund the Irish Wetland Bird Survey. So monitoring is the first step, and then comes designation, etc. So the overall objectives of the survey is to determine the size of the water bird populations. From those estimates, then identify important sites for water birds, assess how their numbers and their distribution is changing over time, and then use this to inform decisions. And a lot of our special protected areas would be important sites for wintering water birds, and that would definitely be, if not the main, certainly one of the criteria that they are designated based on. So it's really, really important information that's collected. How do we do it? Well, the survey methods are actually quite straightforward. It's just a look-see method. So basically, you just look and count birds that occur within predefined boundaries. And this is just usually the boundary of particular wetlands or field boundaries and stuff where the birds occur. There is one count a month from September through to March. There is particular emphasis on January because a lot of species numbers peak in January. So this data is used for the International Waterbird Census, which is run by Wetlands International. And so those figures go towards estimating the flyway populations. I'll mention that again a little bit later, but to try and coordinate the counts as best as possible, we do have a schedule of pre-selected dates, and one for the East Coast and one for the kind of West Coast, so that, because unfortunately the tide isn't the same the whole country over, but this allows us to try and get a good clear snapshot of what the birds are doing at a particular time, because unfortunately they do fly, so they can move around a lot between the different count dates, and if we can coordinate this as best as possible, all the better. And another way we try to get as good a snapshot and ensure that comparability is to keep tidal sites on the high end of rising. It doesn't always occur that way specifically. It depends. At some sites, it doesn't make sense to count on that particular tide, but by and large, I-WeBS is a rising tide survey. And to reduce double counting, then ideally counts of sites will be completed within 3 hours. And as it's difficult for one person alone to cover a large site within this 3 hours and on that particular tidal state, in the one day, teams are used to count large sites. So there's a good coordinated effort within sites as well. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the sites are subdivided. So sites are then broken down into smaller count units known as subsites. This is really useful because it gives us fine scale data within sites, which can tell us which particular areas are good for different species. It also allows the boundaries to be easily recognized. And so when we're coordinating counts with large teams, we can assign different sections to different people. When people are pulling out the data requests, they can also recognize specifically where in Dundalk Bay are the most important areas for black-tailed godwit. There are some species that get where I-WeBS doesn't give us the highest level resolution of detail as we would like. For example, some species use a lot of grassland sites and therefore might be missed at some of the major I-WeBS sites. So we do have dedicated additional surveys. Some of these are annual, like the grey lag surveys and the Brent geese surveys and post-breeding tern surveys as well, which are relatively new, and some are cyclical. So like the barnacle goose survey would occur every 5 years. The Hooper and Buick swan census, the international swan census, was last held in 2020. So I'm sure many of you were involved in that. And news will be coming up in the next couple of years as well. So that's one to watch out for. A big effort going into counting the non-estuarine area. So all those bits of the extreme coastline that we don't necessarily get out to in normal I-WeBS. And this helps supplement our database then and fill in those gaps for us. So then the actual methodology and what you need. Well, some of the most important things are optics, because waterbirds are incredibly difficult to survey with the naked eye. Certainly at a lot of these sites, they are completely impossible to survey without telescope, let alone binoculars. So they are key. Then you also need a notebook and a pen or a pencil, and always handy to have a second pen or pencil when you're out trudging through these wetland areas. Very easy to misplace one. So don't leave yourself stuck. A tally counter is very useful, especially for big groups of waterbirds. Certainly when you're getting to know the area, a map of your boundaries is really useful. And never any harm to have a waterbird identification guide with you, a field guide. just in case you come across things you're not quite sure of, which with the conditions you come across with poor lighting and wind shake and rain can happen more often than you might think. So yeah, just a quick demonstration of how important optics can be for seeing these birds. So these Canada geese out in the middle of a lake could potentially be a lot of things until you get a good proper zoomed in look at them. So optics are really important. Important details to record then when you're actually out in the field are the date and start and end times, particularly where you are. If you know your site and subsite codes off by heart, absolutely use them. But some people might use just their own colloquial names and maybe even a grid reference, which is fine once you know what you mean it is, so that you can then assign it to the right subsite when you're sending the data into us. Obviously, not all sites will be tidal, but where you are at a tidal site, important to note whether it was rising or high or low or falling. And of course, then what birds there were and how many there were. One thing that's really useful as well, if you can, when you're getting into I-WeB and getting into recording water birds, is to, and indeed any birds, is to learn the shorthand BTO codes. It saves so much time being able to just write WN instead of widgeon, or like BW instead of black-tailed godwit. Especially when your hands are cold and shaking, you want to minimize the amount of time you have to spend writing. Or indeed if you're flustered with lots of birds in front of you. And it's good then as well to record what any problems you might have come across, in particular those that might affect the accuracy of the count. So if you didn't get to cover your whole site, or there was high levels of disturbance, poor visibility, or maybe ice, that would affect how representative the count was of that site and the numbers that usually occur there. Really important to make a little note of those things so that you can tell us then when you're submitting your data. And as I was saying earlier, we do have pre-selected scheduled dates, and these are adhered to at a lot of the sites, but it won't always be feasible to stick to those dates. So if you're not doing the counts on those dates, if you're not bound by doing the counts on those dates, then it's good to plan your count as best as you can. Avoid weather where it's going to be very rainy or windy, which will impact you being able to accurately identify the birds. Avoid kind of the midday sun and that dreaded silhouette. Think about the light and whether you're going to be looking straight into it. Consider your tides if that's applicable to you. Avoid times of maximum disturbance, which is a big thing at a lot of sites now. For example, avoiding Sundays. And a lot of our counters actually, I coordinate Dublin Bay counts. A lot of my counters would prefer the accounts where you start at the crack of dawn as opposed to those where you're starting closer to midday, because of the light, but also because there's just people milling around and putting the birds up and things like that. So good to, get familiar with your site, note those periods and avoid them when doing counts if possible. It will make your life easier. And then if you are part of a team, part of counting a site that is subdivided, it's important to communicate with each other so that you can tell someone, like, I already counted that flock. Or just let them know when birds are on the move. Ensure everybody knows where to go. One of the tricks you can use if you're caught out and have to deal with wind shake is to get down nice and low. And when you're actually on the ground, on D-Day, carrying out your first count, if at all possible, know your site, do up a little reading on it. We have site summaries online. So get a sense of what species you should expect there, establish where are the best vantage points, safe places for you to pull in, where you can see the birds, and know your count boundaries. By all means, bring the map with you if you want on the day. And when you're starting the count, then scan the site. It's often good to scan the site with your binoculars and get a sense of what species are there. Maybe even noting them down on your notebook is really handy as well. It just kind of makes it feel that bit more methodical. And, you know, when you're thinking back then, having been kind of panicked about what you have or haven't counted, you can see, you know, what species were there at the start and which ones you might have missed and are still to get to. So just make a quick list. And also then if you can't ID any species accurately, in general, that probably just it won't be that useful to us, but there are cases where you can say, you know, like unidentified wader, which at least is a little bit of information better than nothing. But if you can't ID it, then you know, just be honest about that. And a good way to start as well is to get a sense of where the biggest concentrations are. If you're totally blindsided, no idea what, how you're supposed to begin, when we look at the biggest concentrations, or indeed flocks that are the most likely to lift and run away. Another thing that's kind of becoming a little bit more prevalent at sites as well, actually, is the areas that are closest to disturbance. You can start there, and if there's a flock that a dog is about to run through, good idea to start with that and get a quick estimate before they fly away on you. And then you can methodically kind of go through the other species with a bit more ease. If you're counting the sea or open water, also don't forget to do several scans, because diving species can be very sneaky. The likes of common scoter out on the waves, even though they're kind of jet black on a calm day, even they can kind of be like appearing and disappearing from behind the waves. So good to train your eye in on those things and be aware that you might miss them on one look and catch them on another. So it's good to know your boundary. Good to know it on paper for sure, but knowing it in person is a little bit different as well, because aerials don't give you the full picture. Right? They don't tell you, you know, maybe what like might be impeding your way around. They don't tell you where the best vantage points are. They don't tell you what might kind of blocking your view. So good to get out down on the ground at your site and scope out, preferably in advance of the survey, because it can add a bit of panic to the survey if you're only going there the first time and trying to figure out where to park. I've been there myself several times, having to count sites that are not my own. And yeah, so knowing what is a good vantage point really helps. So always somewhere that allows you good views of the site, is safe and has easy access. You might not always have to fully access a site. Often you can view it from the periphery. Somewhere that causes minimum disturbance to birds, of course, will be both beneficial to you and to the birds. Getting a bit of height can actually make all the difference. Speaking from someone who is very short, I can tell you that is completely true. And also having helpful features and reference points is always a bonus. So something like this would be quite good. You can see most birds, but if you can get a little bit higher, you can see that there's a couple of species, a couple of individuals that are a bit more clear then. And also you will often need to get a view of the site from multiple angles, but be aware that when you're doing this, when you're moving around the site and viewing it from different places, it can be easy to lose track of what you've already counted and then fall into the trap of double counting. So definitely use site features wherever you can and draw these imaginary lines. In this diagram, the wall creates and tree create quite a clear line. And often it won't be that straightforward. But you know, there might be like a stick poking out of the water, or an old bin on the shoreline or something. So I've counted roughly to that bin. So when I go around to my next vantage point, I'll count then from the bin upwards to my next reference point. Yeah, and then beware of those species that might be kind of hidden as well. There are cases, especially with like tall grass and reeds, where you might be aware that there are more birds in there, but you can't actually make out accurately how many there are. This often happens with the likes of teal and stuff. So if you know that the birds that you've counted is an underestimate, you can just mark that down then, and we will be able to tell that the particular count isn't representative of teal at that site because some of them were hidden. And then during counts of large sites, communication with others is really helpful because birds might move between the different areas. It is good to kind of keep an eye on birds' movements as best as possible. And then if it hasn't been quite so easy these days with the various restrictions in place, but if you can meet up for a coffee afterwards for the excuse to heat yourself up, reward after your early morning out in the cold, it's a great way to compare your numbers and minimize any kind of duplication of the counts that you might have got between two different sections. And just a little graphic of how that might go down. So see a flock of golden plover and you're just hoping beyond hope that it's in someone else's section, someone else's problem. But whoever you might want to discuss then, whoever can get a better count, more accurate count, and compare your numbers afterwards. In terms of actually counting then the techniques that are used to estimate the bird numbers, sometimes it's really simple. Sometimes the birds are sitting pretty, waiting for you, or they're in nice small numbers. Just 6 shoveler, not too bad. But sometimes it's a little bit more complicated. There's a bunch of species all mixed in together. Might be very far away. There might be, bad weather at play, poor lighting. But just remember all the things, the steps we went through earlier, and above all, stay calm. Just take it one thing at a time. Take note of what's there. Tackle one species at a time, starting with the largest flocks or flight risks. So in this picture, you might start with the swans, get them out of the way, and then that's like a quarter of what you're looking for, done and dusted, nice and easy. Or indeed flocks like knot and golden plover, you might want to get them because they're quite a flight risk. Counting large flocks of birds, it is tricky. And it is an estimate. So one thing that you can do is just make a quick estimate and then get a more detailed count when you have time. This allows you both to ensure that you have some kind of idea of what numbers are there if the birds move on, and also just when you have time, then you can get a more detailed count. It's a good idea, and in fact, I would say necessary to count in blocks of bigger numbers for these big flocks of birds, but certainly counting in blocks for any numerous species is really a key trick to this methodology. So one of the things I like to do is kind of break it down to something that you're familiar with. So just start out with oranges. You don't have to worry about the ID with this, just the numbers. So this is 20 oranges. Certainly when you're getting used to the methodology, and ideally not even on account, just when you're out at a wetland watching birds messing around, try out the methodology of counting a block on the outside of the flock individually, get a sense of what that block looks like. And then you can count in blocks therein. And this is where a tally counter comes in really handy. So instead of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, up to 20 4 times, you'll just say, right, that's about a block of 20, 1 click, 2 clicks, 3 clicks, 4 clicks, and 5 or 6 extra then. So we have, yeah, that's, then you have your count. Be aware as well of these, beware of these more tightly packed individuals as well. Wader flocks in particular are bad for this, but you can get it anywhere, but especially towards the center of the flocks, they can be really densely packed. And so your circle of 20, your block of 20 can look about half the size as what it is on the outside. So just be mindful of that to adjust the size of your grouping as you go along. Really useful for this to have good optics and a steady tripod, and certainly a tally counter. Okay, so if I can get the poll working on this, we're going to try just do a little bit of multiple choice and see kind of what estimate you think the different groupings are, the different pictures. So for this one, let's see. Can you see the poll? If you can, just throw in how many you think, what's the closest estimate? 50, 80, or 100? It's fluctuating a lot. Kind of teetering between 50 and 80. Yeah, so I'm just going to end it there. I don't know what your results does. So yeah, 50 was the winner. 80 was a close second, and not a lot of people picked 100. So then if I divide it up into groups, this one isn't as hard because obviously there's less, but just to demonstrate the kind of technique. So then now that you can see them, how many do you think there are? Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely, everybody's avoiding the 31 option. So we have 31, 44, or 56. Few people are saying 44, which it is absolutely 56. So yeah, you can see that the groupings there then make it a lot easier. Right, for this one, roughly, how many do you think? Berry apples. Yeah. Even split there for a second. Yeah, so good answers coming in there. These are pretty on the ball. I'm actually not going to show you the answer to this one because then we'll have a look at what size. Have a look to the group. What kind of size do you think these groupings are? How many do you think is in each grouping? Yeah, absolutely. There's 50 in each of the grouping, which definitely won the poll there. And you can easily kind of estimate what's in each group, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. So obviously it was 200 apples then. It just helps to break it down. Then for actual birds, tell me how many not do you think are in this grouping for starters? Yeah, 100%. So there's 50 in that grouping. So then if that's 50, what do you think is the closest estimate for this grouping? All right, let's show you the options. 150, 170, or 200? Definitely feel like we have some experienced counters in the audience. Results are showing. Yeah, so there's actually 170 in this group, but you kind of can tell when you flick back and forth between the grouping and this. There's kind of like 350s and then not quite another 50, but the top guesses were 150 and 170, and they're the closest to true. And when you're counting, when you're estimating bird numbers, in honesty, like 20, the difference of 20 or 30, in the grand scheme of things, it isn't that big a difference. You know, it's still showing you a similar picture of how healthy or unhealthy the bird numbers are over time. And certainly, if one person is counting a site and then their counts are comparable to their previous year's counts over time, so you're always going to be getting the same kind of picture over time by using these estimates. And similarly, then let's go back to these bananas as well. So you might, this grouping on the outside, you might consider that to be another 10, and then you would estimate that to be 60. But at the same time, the difference between 50 and 60, when the actual truth is 56, is not that big a deal. So definitely like hone in on your skills of grouping birds. But one of the things as well is just not to stress about it too much. I'm a devil for doing that, and something I had to train myself out of over time, not getting hung up too much on the small stuff. The estimate is the estimate. So certainly go out and practice the technique, but if you're getting a 56 instead of a 60, it's not going to be the end of the world, basically. And then with large flocks, obviously we only went up to groupings of 50s there, but with large flocks, you might want, you would want to be using groupings of 100 or maybe even thousands. And that does take a little bit of practice and a bit of getting used to. And certainly for flocks in flight as well. Mixed flocks can be a bit overwhelming as well when they're all mixed in together, especially if it's something that you feel like is going to be very time consuming and you're up against it in terms of the tide or what have you. So a good technique is to quickly estimate the overall numbers of the flocks and get a sense of what proportion of each species are there. Is it 30% common gulls and the rest are black-headed gulls? Is it 10% red shank and 90% oyster catcher? And then when you have time, go back and get a more detailed count of each of the species. And we were saying earlier as well that it's easy to miss things out on the sea. So scanning and rescanning the water is really important. And so they can just be a band of these little dots that surprisingly get very well hidden by the waves, even on calm days. Diving species in particular, because they're not only easy to easily hide behind waves, but they also dive. So good to keep an eye out for them. Similarly with things on land as well. yeah, watch out when you're out on grassland sites and things too, because what actually could easily be mistaken as a strip of mud here out on the Curragh was 5,000 golden plover. So it can be surprisingly easy to miss things. Keep a keen eye. Hooper swans are another one that can be surprising as well. So good to keep an eye out in the fields for them. If you're seeing any particularly pristine looking sheep, you should be suspicious and take a second look. It might just be a flock of swans waiting to be counted. And then, flocks in flight, very overwhelming, very difficult to count, and you often have limited time because they're on the move and flying away from you. Sometimes also they like to do this thing of being in multiple layers flying different directions, so it can be difficult, and it's not an exact science. Where possible, consider the depth and density, how many rows of them there are, and count in big blocks. Go straight for big blocks if you've got a big flock in flight. And then, if possible, like if you watch them and they settle again, refine your estimate when you have time. And practice, practice, practice. Okay. I don't have a poll set up for these ones, and some of you might have seen these before, so you might have the upper hand. We'll just take a few minutes to see, or a few seconds, sorry, to try and estimate how many there are. How many? If you like, you can put it in the chat, or you can just think on yourself how close you are. So there's 15 birds here, 14 godwits and 1 knot. So you might have missed the knot, and it can be hard to identify the species in flight, but the longer you watch them, the more you get used to their features. Little toes sticking out past their tail for the godwits, and they're that bit bigger. Oh. I will take questions at the end of this counting techniques, if that's okay. I saw someone raised a hand there. Sorry, there we go. Okay, the next one. How many do you think? I realize now there's actually no slide. Answer slide for this, but there are 60 teal. So it's, as you probably spotted, a fake picture. Not a real flock of teal. And then for this one, how many? Well, yeah, got some good guesses coming in there. Yeah, very close. 63. And just a demonstration there then of how in flight you might roughly chop them up into their groupings. Okay, this one's a big one. So I'll give you a couple more seconds. Any guesses? Not bad. The range of guesses. We have from 200 to 800. 800 is pretty close. Almost bang on, -1 bird. So there's about 745 knot and 14 black-tailed godwit. Black-tailed godwit in particular, you can kind of see the edges. They're going through it. But yeah, so as you can see, it's difficult. It is an estimation, and And it just takes time. It takes time and patience and many deep breaths out in the field. So I just going to stop sharing for a second. I just want to check in on the time. Okay, I think we'll blitz through the identification section, and then I will give time for a few sections if that's okay for the person who raised the hand. So methodology, we're still in the methodology section, but going to look a little bit at identification. And I know there's a few seasoned counters here, so I'm sure many of you will know this kind of stuff. So good things to consider when you're trying to figure out what you're looking at is where it is, what kind of habitat, and also where in the country, where in the world. What is it doing in terms of its behaviors, what's it feeding on, that kind of thing. What general shape is it? Big, stocky, slim, long bill, short bill, and what size is it? The general impression of its size and shape. And shape is really useful factor because it's connected to both their habitat and their behavior. It's not an accident that different birds are shaped differently and have different shaped bills. It's connected to what they eat and what they do, how they live their lives. Same with, garden birds. You will see seed-eating finches have big, thick bills so that they can crack seeds. Insectivores have skinny little bills so they can peck between bark, etc. And gauging general impression, gauging shape and size and the general impression that something gives off is nothing new to you. It's definitely something you can do because you've already done this with many everyday objects and people in your lives and things like that who you can just recognize from a distance just by the way that they walk or carry themselves or their big wide stature, etc. And similarly with everyday objects like fruit, you know them just by their shape, even if you don't see their kind of characteristic colors, etc. So the same thing applies for birds. You have all these, you're just gaining all these little bits of information and storing them in your library. So over time, you'll be able to whittle down quicker and quicker what the species are that you're looking at. Again, with identification, don't panic. The key message today, if you have not picked up on it, is don't panic. It can probably only be a small selection of species anyway. They can be really overwhelming, especially when you have a big Collins guide in front of you, big thick thing with species, some of them from far off parts of Europe, some of them from America, that you're not likely to find here. For some, it's not impossible, but not likely. So whittle it down to what you know is likely to be there. And considering what it's doing, and indeed where it is, can really help you to do this. So with the ducks, for example, if you know that they're divided up into diving species and surface feeding species, then when you see a duck diving, you know it can't be any of these list of surface feeders. And then your list is already whittled down a lot. On top of that, then you can layer where you are. So you've got diving ducks, but you're in a lake, so you know you're at a lake, so you know it can't be sea duck like common scoter or eider. And that whittles it down further. So for example, if you had this mystery duck with a brown head, identifying that it has a brown head has already whittled down the options of what you can be looking at. So it could be a male pochard, a female goosander, a female red-breasted merganser, a male widgeon, or a male teal, because all of these have a red head. Oh, but then if it's a surface feeder, you know it can't be any of those other species, those diving species. So that whittles you down to two species, just widgeon and teal, and then it pivots and you can see that it has a buff kind of yellowy stripe on its head which is absent in teal, so it must be widgeon. And that's just the kind of general process, whether or not it's that strategic every time. Your brain is kind of going through that process as you get to know birds. What is it and what is it not? And there are helpfully several confusion species out there that can look quite similar. For example, you think that golden eye is quite a unique feature, but then golden eye and tufted duck both have this striking yellow eye. But when you get to know their shape, goldeneye have, even without considering their plumage patterns, goldeneye have this peaked triangular kind of head, whereas tufted duck have a nice soft rounded head with a tuft at the back. So shape alone tells you a lot. And then also tuning into different wing patterns, in particular for birds in flight, can be super helpful. So as you can see for tufted duck, the white wing bar runs along the wing, but for goldeneye, it runs down the wing. Just, yeah, the way they carry themselves, their overall shape and structure, like shoveler, for example, which you won't often confuse with any other species, but if all of their heads are tucked in and you just see kind of white and black and chestnut, shelduck can be thrown in there as a confusion species for these. But shoveler are so stocky and kind of brutish looking in a way that they're a very easy one to pick out usually. Whereas shelduck are actually quite big. They're kind of closer to duck size than they are. They're closer to goose size than they are duck size. So often you'll see them, you'll notice them from a mile away. And then, yeah, head shape in general with the ducks is a really good thing to tune into. So between tufted duck and pochard, tufted duck have that really steep decline with their forehead and the tuft at the back. Pochard will never have a tuft. It also has a gently sloping forehead with no bump or crest at the back. As you can see the difference then, pochard, quite like a slide, whereas tufted duck's nice rounded head. And you might be thinking, is she correct? These two species look totally different. And you're right, they do. But actually, out in the field, it can be surprisingly hard to pick apart species, especially when they're all bunched in together and maybe your visibility isn't that clear. So it can be harder in the field. Oh, just a couple of quiz questions then. I'll do the poll for this one. How many different types of species do you think are in this picture? Can't fool you guys and gals. Yeah, there's 4 species. We have tufted duck, pochard, mallard, and coot. Not a terribly difficult one, but just keeping you on your toes. There isn't actually a poll for this one, but just to demonstrate how you can pick out features even on silhouetted species. So either enter into the chat or just have a think with yourself. Do you know which of these species number 1, 2, and 3 are? Now, of course, number 1 is pintail, this big, long, iconic tail. It's a very elegant, long neck. Long neck totally absent in the shoveler, which does have a big, heavy bill. Number 2, and then mallard. Actually, nothing majorly distinct in the silhouette if you don't hone in on this curly tail. It does have that kind of very iconic duck-shaped head that is very, very mallard. Then just to give the women their day in the sun. Which species is which of the female ducks? Whereas pintail, for female ducks, they do still have quite a long um, tail feathers, but in general, I think what always captures me with pintail is just how elegant they look, and this kind of soft black eye makes them look very sweet and innocent in a way. Shoveler, of course, they still have that big stocky shape and that big stocky bill. Female mallard, they have an orange bill and also this speculum with the lovely blue color and the white bands either side of it. I won't lie to you, a lot of the female ducks do look very similar. They all have this quite drab brown, a lot of them, sorry, not all of them, have this kind of drab brown plumage, which helps them, you know, evade predators and be more kind of cryptic on the breeding grounds when they're sitting on eggs, etc. But it can make life difficult in the field. But certainly when you get used to their general impression of the size and shape, when you get used to these different features that they each have, like the speculum, etc., those little tricks really help you build up over time. So waders then, a group that's really annoying for quite a lot of people. A lot of people find them really difficult. It's a similar kind of process of elimination, but additionally good to consider bill length, leg length, and color. For the smalls, for example, you know, you have the likes of Dunlin and Sanderling, but they move quite differently. Sanderling run along the beach in this kind of like hurried fashion. And also they have this brilliant white color as well. So they're a bit like, you know, the rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. If you see smalls along the beach, that might instantly kind of limit you to a few numbers of waders, and then the fact that they're on the beach will knock off like the purple sandpiper, which is only really found out on the rocky places. You notice they don't have orange legs, and so that only leaves you with Sanderling, Knott, and Dunlin. But Knott are that little bit bigger, so you know, the really small ones will leave you between just Sanderling and Dunlin maybe, and then you see them hurrying along the shoreline, chasing it in and out, feeding, and it might just be the thing that clinches it for you. Many different examples of this, you know, how a little kind of behavior might clinch the ID for you, like the way a red shank moves, really good one to spot, even when silhouetted. Although they don't look, you know, to some they probably don't look that similar side by side, Knott and Dunlin, but they can cause a lot of confusion in the field, especially with, you know, at a distance and stuff. But one of the tricks that's good to use with waders, and with these waders in particular, is the proportions of the head to bill. So as you can see, Dunlin have quite a long bill in comparison to their head, and it has this bit of a down curve, whereas Knott, the head is a bit bigger than the bill. In fact, this is exactly the same same diagram used, but just flipped around for Knott. So the proportions are that bit different. I think godwits are probably one of the biggest bone of contentions for people in trying to, not bone of contention, but they're really difficult for people, and they still cause, you know, confusion and difficulty for seasoned counters when the lighting is bad, and factors just don't line up. So we're only considering wintering plumage, the more drab of the plumage. Sometimes you will see them transitioning at either side of the I-WeBS period, but in general, they're donning their lovely subtle grey colours. With black-tailed godwit, they're generally kind of longer and more elegant. They do have longer legs, which is part of the reason they have a very long, straight bill, whereas bar-tailed godwit, in comparison, have a bit of an up curve to the bill. And black-tailed godwit are more consistently kind of buff grey, which I think does contribute to this kind of look of elegance as well. And then with bar-tailed godwits, they look a little bit more streaked and have this longer supercilium, the eye. Some people like to use the trick, the bar-tailed godwits, because they have shorter gap between the false knee and the body, that you can only fit the letters B-A or in there. So smaller bird and smaller word. Whereas with black-tailed godwits, you could fit the full 5 letters in black between the false knee and the body. Sometimes as well, I think with black-tailed godwits, when you see them feeding, because they're that bit more gangly, they look a little bit like they're going to topple over. So that's something to look out for too. Obviously, the black tail with a black-tailed godwit is a good giveaway as well. And when they're in flight, you can, sometimes you don't see it when it's hidden. So if you can afford to wait a little bit till they move and flash that black tail at you, then you know you've clinched it. They also project their legs out beyond the tail and show this white wing bar and a white rump in flight. Whereas with bar-tailed godwits, the legs are by and large hidden when they're in flight. They don't have that wing bar along the edge of the wings, and they have this elongated white rump, which is actually present in a few other wader species as well, like curlew, whimbrel, and redshank. Again, color can be a helpful factor in clinching what birds you're looking at, and grouping them together. Sometimes color can be a bit misleading. Sometimes everything can be misleading in the field, depending on conditions and perspective. Size isn't always that helpful, for example, but when you can see color clearly, it really helps you kind of whittle down what you're looking at. So in terms of orange leg species, you might have redshank, purplet, sandpiper, ring plover, and turnstone. So consider all the things like their size, where they are, what they're doing. If they're very small, it's not going to be a redshank. If it's not by rocky coast, it's generally not going to be purple sandpipers, that kind of thing. And then just their behavior. So redshank walk with this really kind of jerky movement. Can look like they're the kind of cock of the walk a little bit, which is really useful because you can often spot them even when they're just silhouetted. Turnstone, on the other hand, can go around rummaging the seaweed, and that will often be what alerts you to their presence, because they're quite cryptic species and you don't always see them out in the open. Redshank would be, because it's a good medium size, it's bigger than the smalls, but it's smaller than the bigger birds like the godwits and curlew. And it has this really distinctive walk and those orange legs, the orange bill. To me, I think it's a really good starter bird. If you can get your eye in on what a redshank is and know a redshank in almost any situation, it will help you then further whittle down a species from there and compare them to redshank, both in size and color, etc. So again, just looking at this process of if you see birds with orange legs, but it's on the beach, so you know it's not a purple sandpiper, but it's very small, and then you see that it's like flicking seaweed in search of insects and prey, then it's almost always going to be a turnstone. Redshank in flight as well, then they have this elongated white wedge like we saw on the bar-tailed godwit, and you will see this in a few different waders as well, like greenshank and curlew. But they also have that distinctive white on the wing, and their little orange toes are sticking out beyond their tail. Plus, they're very noisy. If you disturb them, they will let you know, which can sometimes be helpful. When deciding what it was. But then greenshank, by comparison, which can be quite similar, they don't have that white bar on the wing and do have white on the tail, as opposed to this barred look that redshank have going on. And onto gulls then, which by and large are very daunting group, and certainly when you throw in all the juvenile stages. But focusing just on the adults for now, they can be divided into large gulls and smaller gulls. So the large gulls are great blackback, lesser, and herring gull, whereas the smaller ones are blackback gull and common gull, and also Mediterranean gull, now becoming a bit more common, widely distributed as well. So good to take into account their size, also the color of the wings on the back, the leg color, the kind of the color and the shape of the bill, and what's going on their wingtips. So the large gulls, great blackback gull, often will be easy to distinguish because they're big, very heavy bill, very kind of brutal looking birds, although gorgeous at the same time. They have these jet black plumage on their backs, and they have obviously the yellow bill with the red dot. One of the big things to notice is that they have pink legs. And they're the biggest gull, biggest gull we have here, and biggest gull in the world. So they more often than not, you'll get them just by their sheer kind of size and presence. Then for lesser blackback gulls, they have more of a slate grey, so in between the two. But all of these plumages can be altered a little bit by the light, so you might need other factors to rely on. So the lesser blackback gull has a somewhat less heavy bill, still quite heavy, which is not as mean. They also have the yellow bill with the red dot, but they have yellow legs. Then herring gulls, lighter again, less heavy bill altogether, the smaller of the three, but they have pink legs. So this is important because if you're wondering whether it's a lesser or a herring and you see that it has yellow legs, then you know it's a lesser. If you're wondering whether it's a greater or a lesser and it has yellow legs, you know it's a lesser. So that's a really useful trick. And then the geese. There's not too many geese to consider, so you'll usually be able to figure out what they are quick enough. But in general, people kind of group them into black geese, which are the light-bellied brown geese, barnacle geese, and Canada geese, and grey geese, which are Greenland white-fronted geese, grey legs, and pink feet. They are the most usual ones you come across. But the black geese, light-bellied, and brown geese and barnacle geese in particular are coastal in their distribution. Barnacle geese are found mostly on the west coast, particularly out on the islands, but places up around Sligo and Donegal are more likely to have them. Brown geese are coastal, and all around the coast of Ireland you won't find them in the inland counties, whereas white fronts and grey legs are highly faithful to their wintering areas. They'll be seen in a lot of the same places all the time, and often grazing in fields close to water usually. The big thing about the Greenland white-fronted goose is the white front on the base of the bill, also the barring on their stomach, and those orange legs. Otherwise, they're just kind of quite grey, similar to grey leg geese, but you'll notice they don't have the white front and like stark orange bill. They also have kind of pinky orange legs. Notice too the white rump. Another one is pinkfoot geese, and they are similar kind of in plumage colors, but they have these pink legs. They're a little bit more kind of like chocolate brown on the head, and they're generally a bit kind of cuter and neater than the other two. They have the black bill with a bit of pink on it, and even in flight, to be honest, they're often quite easy to pick out because they're that little bit neater. And then between the black geese, a lot of it comes down to they all have the black head and neck, but you'll notice the white patterning is very different. Brown geese only have that white collar, a little bit less noticeable in the juveniles, but you'll see the kind of white collar, the lovely soot black head and neck. Canada goose, on the other hand, have that white chin strap, and barnacle geese have a kind of white face mask. Barnacle geese have really cute kind of neat bill, as do as do Brent geese, not quite as small and neat, but Canada geese don't. They're that little bit bigger, more pronounced kind of bill. For the swans, again, we don't have many species to choose between, so by and large it should be all right. We just have one orange bill swan, the mute swan, and two yellow-billed swans, which are the Hooper swan and Buick swans. And again, there aren't many places where you will have to wonder which is which, because our Buick swan numbers have plummeted, and it's very likely in coming years they will become locally extinct. Another thing between mute swan and the yellow-billed swans, because mute swan have this black at the base of their bill and the black knob, the head, the slope of the head, it also looks quite different. Yeah, and so you will often find all of the swans feeding in fields, but with Hooper swan, the big thing is that the yellow wedge swoops right down beyond the nostril, whereas it stops short of the nostril always with Buick swans. And they are in general just a little bit neater and have a smaller neck than Hoopers. How many Hoopers do you see in this picture? Just one, of course, and these two, because you can see the big wedge of yellow on the bill, and for these two, it's nice and short, and they're that little bit neater. They are Buick swans. Sometimes you can see the birds nice and clearly, but sometimes they're very far away. And sometimes they're quite dark and dull and just looks like a bit of a gray mess. So knowing the difference between their sizes and the difference in their behaviors, it makes everything a lot easier. Also knowing what you should and shouldn't expect there can really help. So when you're getting to grips with water bird identification, there's no shortcut, unfortunately. It does take a lot of practice and a lot of time and a lot of patience. But it's a very enjoyable thing to do and accessible to, you know, pretty much everybody. And knowing what is familiar at a site, knowing what to expect really helps. So learning a bit about the birds in books, blogs, magazines, and see BirdWatch Ireland's Wings magazine offers lots of really really good Irish specific information. If you can count with somebody else, even if it's not somebody else's experience, that can help. But if you count with somebody who does know how to identify their water birds, that's great. You might pick up a lot of little tips and tricks, and never be afraid to consult your ID guide either. So thanks for that. Welcome back. So, resume the presentation if we have everybody on board. So making it meaningful then. Once the work has been done, how do we turn it into kind of tangible results and meaningful data? As this sad cat implies, if counts are not in the database, they cannot be used for analysis, and this is not very good. Because it means all your hard work then, you know, it's not for nothing, of course, but it because the surveys are enjoyable, etc. But it can't be contributed to our kind of national populations and things like that. So it's important to get the counts in, and there's two different key ways that you can do that. That is the paper forms or online. So with the paper forms, you can submit, and they can take 7 counts for each subsite, whereas the online system takes 1 visit, so 1 count of 1 subsite at a time. I mean, you can continually enter subsite visits on the online system, but just 1 at a time. And it is a new system, so better than what we had before, which unfortunately crashed. And many thanks to all of the counters who were patient with us during that time, before we got a new system up and running, but we do have it in place now. So with the paper form, there's a simple box to enter your own details. Each person is given a unique counter code, so that we can distinguish between the various Joe soaps around the country. It wouldn't surprise you that in Ireland we might come across a lot of repeat names. And online then, you will either have to manually enter these details, or you can be given a personalized link in which your details, your name, email, and counter code are already pre-filled. And if you don't have that link already, but are using the online system, drop me a line, because it's really useful to have this link and bookmark it and keep reusing it. Just a quick note that these links don't, the jot form where the online system is hosted isn't compatible with Internet Explorer. So if that's your default browser, just watch out for that. And then the visit details. So tell you about the visit and the conditions on the day. For count unit, it's really important to let us know the subsite code, because there are lots of similarities in place names, and also conversely, a single site or a single place can be known by several different names. So in order to remove all the confusion around this, we have a specific codes against each subsite and site. For the paper forms, we print and stick on these little clear stickers that will have all the subsite details on them usually, just to demonstrate that place names are not always very reliable. There's Rathstrom, where I'm from. There's both in Wicklow and in Tipperary. So yeah, it usually comes with this label though, so you might not have to worry about it with the paper forms, but it is good to know them. And especially for submitting online, where you do have to enter them manually in this subsite code box. But if you cannot remember them offhand and you know the name of your subsite, there is a search function just below the subsite code box. Other visit details then, like date, time, count conditions. For the paper forms, you can put the 7 of those in all at once. The more legible, the better. And for visit details, on the online system, a lot of them will be default. So for you have core, counter, supplementary count. I'll walk you through supplementaries later. But core is the default, because that's what all of your monthly counts will be. Ground is also default, because most people are unlikely to be counting by boat, and none of you are likely to be counting by aircraft. These are specific aerial surveys, are just carried out by MPWS. And then, yeah, tide state's not always applicable, of course. So if you're at an inland site, you can just mark this as NA. Count accuracy is really important to indicate, as it lets us know if a site is not representative of the usual numbers that might occur at that site or subsite, because a lot of the birds were disturbed and moved off the site, or you couldn't count all of the site, for example. So if you feel like the count wasn't quite representative, please mark or tick accuracy as low, circle in this case. And if it's low, then tick why you felt it was low. Was it that all the area wasn't covered? Was visibility poor? Or was there a lot of disturbance? Similarly for the online system, although the default is set as okay, and these three options then will only show if you pick low as the option. When actually putting in the counts, obviously you just write your numbers against the species that you want to indicate. But similarly for individual species counts, you might want to let us know that something affected the quality of the count, and therefore the count of that particular species is not representative of the usual numbers at that subsite. So some of the ways that you can do this is on the paper form to circle counts that are estimated. For those that are known underestimates, like your example of the teal in the rushes, use square brackets to indicate an undercount. And for species that were present but not counted for some reason, this might be the case with gull species, for example, you can simply put an NC. And it is important as well to tick if there was no species present. Nil counts are still valuable to us. It lets us know how the numbers at a site change month to month or year on year, or if the frequency at which the site is being used is going down. So do definitely still enter a count, a nil count, and it doesn't, if you have no birds at your site in 1 month, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get another count. You can just enter that nil count. A lot of sites like Turlock's and things like that often won't have birds until the wetter months. So that's fine if you go out and check it, there's no birds there, still enter that as a visit. And then you also have sections for drop downs for each group of species. So wildfowl allies, waders, and then the gulls, etc. So on the online system, you can indicate count quality, not with circles and brackets, but with this drop down menu that shows you estimates, okay, known underestimate, and I believe there's a present but not counted option as well. So it's all quite straightforward and user-friendly. I believe from using it myself, I found it quite all right. You can always let us know if you have feedback. If other people go out and count with you, we won't necessarily know this unless you tell us their name, and they might be missing out on receiving, the annual mailing of I-WeBS news and just having their name in publications and things like that. So it's good to let us know who they are. If it is somebody who is already established in the database and their counter code, oh sorry, this is actually about additional species, not additional counters. But anyway, sorry, for additional species, so those that aren't listed in this specific box, for each species group, you will be able to add them from this drop-down menu. There should be a list of the less common species there under each group, but if they still don't occur on that list, then right on the last page, you can enter any other species, any other additional species that weren't on any of the drop-down menus or tables. Now to additional counters. Good to let us know who is out counting with you. If you have their counter code, great. If not, let us know their name and an email. For the online system as well, a county at very least, because the address is a bit long to put in, but if you know their county, that's good. We can set them up as a counter in the database then. And for the paper forms, it's simply just to write their name or counter code on the back page. And if they're not an established counter, then good to give us their details, address, and that, so we can set them up in the database, and they will go in on publications and stuff in the acknowledgements and what have you. And for the online system, there is an edit submission function, which was a big bugbear with the old online system that it wasn't very clear how to edit your entries. But there's a couple of ways you can do it with this new system. On the thank you page after you've submitted your records, this link will appear at the end, and you can click that and go straight back into it if you realized you missed a species you hadn't ticked off in your notebook or something. Or after, if you want to go back at a later stage, there's also, you should get an email. If your email was correct in the submission, you should get an email with a summary of your count, and the edit link will be at the bottom of that as well. So it's all pretty easy to use. I just wanted to give you a little bit of the background as to why we ask these questions, because I'm sure at times they can seem like they might have no logic, but they're all valuable information. So then supplementary counts that I mentioned, these can be used for a selection of species where you're not capturing all of the species at the subsite. You've just come across your usual I-WeBS and you've seen that there's pinkfoot geese and grey-lag geese in there that weren't there during your count, or there's an unusually high number of them, or you've spotted a really big group of sea ducks or divers or something out at sea, and you want that information to be captured in the database. This is where supplementary counts come in for those counts that are taken outside core count periods. And also they're useful for if you have got a count, like maybe a casual count as you were passing a lake or something that is not your usual site, but you couldn't pass up the opportunity to record a superb number of species that were there that day. So this is helpful because it avoids duplication and it avoids inflated numbers, because sometimes seen as the database is set up to only accept one core count a month, if 2 core counts go in, these counts will be combined. And if they're actually from 2 different occasions and they're 2 full counts, it'll inflate the numbers. So that's what these are used for. And in paper form, there's actually a dedicated paper form, pink form, for supplementary counts. Again, you can add up to 7 visits for this. But on the online system, the only change you have to make is just to tick supplementary instead of core, and then just enter your counts as usual. So in general, to help us keep up the confidence in the data that we are receiving, it's good to know your subsite boundaries and stick to them as best you can, so as to minimize double counting and ensure long-term comparison. Also, survey at a high tide or rising, or keep the tidal state consistent if you're kind of a little bit different from that historically. Coordinate counts where possible and complete the details on coverage that we just went through, including the likes of whether some of your site was frozen over. And for the species like gulls, tell us whether they were actually there or not, whether they were present and not counted, or simply just absent. Because this lets us know whether they have consistently been counted or whether they were actually just not there. So then once we get the data in, was the collection of it, the counters are central to it all. These get fed into the database via the online system or the forms. But what happens next? Well, the data is used on a really big range of levels, actually, from national right up to international. So it's incredibly useful. On a local level, I-WeBS data feeds into research, impact assessments, planning policy, and publications, like national population and estimates and site monitoring. And this data is all freely available, which is incredibly useful. So you can just request it via the I-WeBS site. On a national level, one of the key use would be to estimate the Irish population numbers and identify important sites from this and examine the changes in our numbers a national level over time. How we identify what sites are important is the 1% rule. So a site is considered to be of national importance to a particular species if it regularly supports 1% or more of the all-Ireland population of that species. So, for example, if there were an estimated 1,500 grey heron wintering in Ireland, then any site that regularly holds 15 or more, i.e. 1%, is a site of national importance for grey heron. And then, as mentioned at the top end of the talk, the January counts in particular are fed into the International Waterbird Census, which does the same kind of process, carries out the same kind of process for the flyway populations, all these international populations of waterbirds, which we share with other countries. And this helps not just assess how the waterbirds are doing, but maybe why there are different trends in their movements, like short stopping and things. And this then generates our ability to assess which and identify which sites are internationally important for waterbirds. And similarly, the 1% rule is used for this. If any site regularly holds 1% or more of the flyway population, then that's considered internationally important for that species. Also, sites that hold more than 20,000 of any combination of water birds are also considered to be internationally important. And these are the kind of criteria that are used for the designation of special protected areas, of which we have several across the country, because we are required to designate and protect these areas through the EU Birds Directive. So what have we found out to date from this incredibly useful vat of data? Well, two of our most recent publications are the population estimates and trends published in Irish Birds, and the Irish Wildlife Manual, which covers population trends and important sites, species by species. So I'll show you some of the profiles. I know we're at time now, but I'll try to run through some of them because their distributions are quite interesting. So when you see green sites, they are internationally important, blue sites are nationally important, and red are just other sites where the species were recorded, but they're not of particular importance for that species. So Greenland white-fronted goose, as I said, quite tied to kind of grassland sites near water. Their population has gone down a lot, which is a big worry because we hold quite a large proportion of the flyway population, and a lot of the birds are now gone, are just in Wexford slobs, and they're gone locally extinct in many other parts of the country. So it's kind of a situation of having all our eggs in one basket, which is not where you want to be. If, God forbid, I-WeBS ever stop the great work that they do at the Wexford slobs, who knows what would happen to this population for which we hold so much responsibility. So it's a significant loss, around 15,000 birds in just 20 years, a really big dip. Light-bellied brent geese, on the other hand, then are very coastal birds, completely different ecology, and they've had a bit of fluctuation over the years, but at the moment they're doing, at the moment they're in a bit of a dip actually, if you see the 5-year trend. But overall, in the 22-year trend, so since the start of I-WeBS, their numbers have increased. They do tend to have quite a lot of fluctuation year on year because of varying breeding success. It's just quite commonly known with French geese that sometimes they have like years with where they produce a lot of juveniles, and others they do not. Widgeon and teal, then, two birds, they come from different directions to us during the winter, but they are very similar in their distribution, very similar in their ecology, and quite similar in their fate as well, in that they have had really significant declines. Both have had quite significant declines, and this is a really big hit to our overall water bird numbers because they are two of our most numerous duck species. So really big declines in their numbers means an overall very large decline in duck numbers, in water bird numbers. Mallard is another one we like to talk about because you can see they're widespread across the country. They're very common, and they no doubt will be the duck that everybody is familiar with. We do have birds that stay here all year round who are resident, but we also get birds then from Iceland, Fennoscandia, Russia, and the Baltic Seas as well. And one of the reasons we might be taking them for granted is that although they seem kind of omnipresent, they are actually on a steady decline, which is not good. Minus 41% is very significant when you consider it's a relatively short space of time. Then on a slightly more positive note, we have little egret, and these maps might not seem very significant to you, but if you look at the previous publication by Boland and Crow, where the same analysis was carried out, the distribution map is very different because their range has expanded a lot just in those few years, where of late they have started to kind of colonize these inland counties because they were primarily coastal before that. They established here first in the late 90s and down in the southwest, and they kind of made their way up around the coast slowly, and now they're becoming more common in inland sites as well. So they have this crazy 22-year trend of over 1,000% because they weren't around at the start. And it's nice to see these natural colonizations, like with the great spotted woodpecker, as we said, even if there is more sinister things at play behind it, like climate change. Sometimes you got to take the good for the good. But unfortunately, the European breeding population is actually in decline. But our population is stable for now. Curlew then, as you can see, they're quite generalist in their ecology, primarily found around the coast, but certainly found on inland sites and grassland sites as well. Not unlike our own breeding population, the international population is in steep decline. No doubt some other of the breeding areas are experiencing similar issues to here, habitat degradation, which increases then their vulnerability to predation and things like that. But yeah, they're in a very steep decline. Wintering curlew is one of the things that causes quite a big confusion for the general public and other people, because the media is going on about how curlew are in decline and almost extinct a lot, and then hundreds maybe turn up at their coastal sites. But these are two different populations. Our own breeding population, some of them might travel south for winter, some of them stay around, but overall there are only a few hundred birds. So in general, in our breeding population at the moment, so yeah, these birds are supplemented with wintering species then, which come from Europe, places like France and things like that. On the flip side again, other good news stories. So black-tailed godwit, which come to us from Iceland and Western Europe, bar-tailed godwit again from the opposite direction in Northern Western Europe. Similar ecology in a way, although one of the tricks you can use if you're confused about what kind of godwit you're seeing on a grassland site is that bar-tailed godwit feed on sandy substrates, not on muddy substrates. Black-tailed godwit do feed on muddy substrates, so they can be found in grassy and some inland sites, but you will never find black-tailed godwit there. Both are increasing, black-tailed godwit more significantly. There is a stable trend for bar-tailed godwit, internationally, and breeding range expansion in Iceland in line with temperature increases might be part of this boom in black-tailed godwits. So some of the overall key findings then, quite grim in general. In just a 5-year period, there was a decline of nearly 140,000 water birds, a 15.5% decline. Waders have experienced the largest declines, 100,000 waders lost in just 5 years. Sites, which would be considered internationally important for holding 20,000 water birds, has fallen dramatically. There were 15 sites in that in Bowlen and Crow publication, ran up to 2004 and 5, but now in the publication that covered the period up until 2015-16, there's only 5 sites that qualify for that criteria. So big declines, as you can see, really steep dip down, and waders had the biggest changes. There have been some increases. Sanderling in particular always put a smile on my face. So lovely to see them increasing. Godwits are gorgeous. Greenshank is a funny one because people were anecdotally saying for a while that greenshank were increasing at their sites, and it's good to have the data to back these things up. The data also debunks some theories, but also backs up things like these quite significant increase in greenshank. So overall, we've had a 40% decline since 94, 95, which is not a very long time, but a very big decrease. Some of this is due to large-scale issues. Climate change is feeding into birds shifting their range because there's their breeding grounds are not frozen over as much, or areas closer to their breeding grounds are not being frozen over as much. Some birds, like Buick swan, are not. It's not energetically as viable for them to travel as far as Ireland, which is right on the edge of their migrating range, when they can stay that bit closer to home and avail of feeding there. With Buick swans, the population is actually now in decline anyway on an international level, but they have been short stopping for a long time, and golden plover are also believed to be short stopping as well, which is one of the reasons, a part of the reason they're in decline. They also faced problems on their breeding grounds when they're not here: predation, poor breeding success, disturbance on their breeding grounds. Disturbance is also a local problem for sure on their wintering grounds when they're in Ireland as well. And that's combined with things like habitat loss or deterioration, habitat modification. All of these things maybe affect prey availability, changes in agriculture practices, developments, pollution, hard engineering. It's, you know, we do get asked quite often, what is it that's causing these declines? And for one, we don't know, because we're just at the monitoring stage, just looking at whether there are declines or increases. But also, it's not just going to be one thing. There's lots of factors feeding in, and that makes it hard to both pinpoint and to approach these problems. But it's just a death by 1,000 cuts, you know, that's causing the decline. So although we think a little bit of disturbance to a few birds might not cause a big issue, but it adds a lot of hurt to them when you're combining it with problems on their feeding grounds, problems on their breeding grounds, and them just not being having safe places, you know, maybe not being as having a safe roosting sites and things like that. It all really feeds into the declines, and it feeds into them not making it back as safe, not making it back to their breeding grounds, but not being able to successfully breed, and therefore the young don't get put back into the population to bump up the numbers and sustain these declines over time. So yeah, so some of you have heard this pitch before, but if it's something that upsets you, the things that you can do are tell politicians that nature is important to you. Tell them that these things are happening and it's not okay. we're losing so many species on so many different levels, and it needs to stop or slow. Well, politicians are the ones that can influence a lot of change around this. So those solutions come from the top down. But they do what the public feel is important. So let them know. Doesn't have to be an attack, just letting them know. Support organisations like BirdWatch Ireland and MPWS. And BirdWatch Ireland's policy department, for example, will be bringing a lot of these issues to the politicians and, you know, the Dáil, etc. So give them your support for those kind of campaigns. When you're out and about, take the path of less disturbance. Get involved in or run local events about wetlands so that other people start to learn about these issues and, you know, solutions around reducing disturbance, etc. By all means, get involved in I-WeBS. Or if you're not cut out for I-WeBS or it's not your thing, there's other surveys, or you, of course, can take on as many surveys as your time allows. And joining local BirdWatch Ireland branches as well is a useful way to just get involved with kind of conservation on the ground and meeting other people who are passionate about these things and who know about things. And just to mention that actually World Wetlands Day is coming up on February 2nd. So in terms of getting involved in events or indeed registering any events that you might be running in relation to wetlands, this is happening on February 2nd. And for the first year ever, it has been recognized as a UN International Day. So that's great. It's officially Wetlands Day. It was the 50 years of World Wetlands Day. It was the anniversary last year. So it's only now becoming fully recognized. So do get involved if you can. Any of you who are coming to the workshops at the weekend, either this weekend or next weekend, they are actually registered as World Wetlands Day events. So you're already taking part. And some of the perks of taking part is that you get a sense of ownership, protecting landscape on your local patch, playing an active part in conservation, the satisfaction of knowing that your counts are making a difference. They're going towards real solutions and real things like designating special protected areas have come from your contribution. And it's a nice excuse to get out during the winter, which is something that I really love about it. Nice to view, to go to these sites and see these birds that you might otherwise let pass you by. For those of you who are interested in I-WeBS and coming to the outings, I will actually go through some of the available sites with you, and we can try to lock in where you would like to take part on the day. But if you are not going to, if you're not going to make it to the outing, then just, and you would like to take part, just drop me an email, or by all means fill in the get involved form if that's not something you have done already. Then once the I-WeBS season finishes and you're wondering what you're going to do with your time, never fear, there is also another survey that you can take part in if you like. And also if people are feeling like overwhelmed by water birds and you only have binoculars, you don't have a telescope yet, the Countryside Bird Survey is a great survey to get involved in, and I'm sure there's lots of people here who are already involved in it, but it nicely fills that gap between I-WeBS and between the I-WeBS, the break in the I-WeBS season. It runs from April to May and involves just 2 counts, unlike our 7 counts. So yeah, if you're interested in finding out more about that, you can email Dick Coombs or coombs@birdwatchireland.ie. His workshops will be coming up in March, I believe. So thanks a million for listening, and thanks as always to all of the photographers who have let us use their images on our various publications and workshops and things. So I will Close the shade.